All right, for more, we are now joined by Dr. Lesley Ann Foster from the Masimanyane Women's Rights International about the dangers faced by women and children in communities. Doctor, it's always a pleasure to see you. Thank you for joining us here on SABC News, ma'am.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me.
You're most welcome. Let's talk about how rife this violence against women is in the Eastern Cape. I mean, we're also hearing, and we saw you speaking in that clip we played just before talking to you now, about instances where women are forced to pay some sort of protection fee. You spoke about a 400 rand that's placed on the windowsill at night. I mean, this is so scary to hear about. It's so concerning. Talk to us about this.
Yeah, I think we still underestimate the degree and the amount of violence that's taking place, particularly in rural areas. And there is a complete lack of understanding. If you hear what the police saying about 2 cases reported, and women are saying that there's so much more of that being reported. I think that we really have a problem in determining exactly the size of the problem so that we can insist on having resources, provided there. But if you look at the Eastern Cape and you look at the statistics, around gender-based violence that the police release every quarter, you can see that we have high levels of domestic violence, high levels of rape and sexual violence, and definitely high rates of femicide. So there's a continued problem, and I think it's absolutely true that rural communities suffer to a greater degree than urban communities do when it comes to accessing the criminal justice system. The lack of infrastructure in rural areas, difficulty for people to get to a police station, to a hospital, to a clinic. All of that impacts on their, their inability to access justice. But I think there's another issue here, and we should be talking a lot more about prevention, because it's not enough to say that, when women have been raped or they have suffered domestic violence, that they, are able to contact the police and get a protection order. What we should be working on is preventing that altogether. And the rural areas are suffering because that kind of information, training, knowledge development, capacity is simply lacking. People are not able to get out. Even organizations like us, we work in rural areas, but it's a limited reach that we have because it takes so much resources to get there.
Yeah.
And my view is, and my experience of working in the Eastern Cape, is that many rural areas are suffering from a very serious levels of gender-based violence. We hear about Lusiki, but Lusiki is one of many hundreds of thousands of villages where women are suffering. And the police haven't got the resources to reach these areas, that we know. And we have to look into that.
So where do we then place the blame? Clearly on the criminals themselves, but apart from that, because it seems you are saying that we can't necessarily place. That was my next question. Do we place the blame on police or women being failed by police? But you paint a different scenario with the fact that there simply aren't any resources, and it's just difficult to access the criminal justice system. So, but these women are being failed. These women in rural areas are being failed. But and who are they then being failed by? Where do we put this blame on?
I think with the new National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence, we call for an all-of-society response to violence against women. That means that the state obviously has primary responsibility, one, for providing protection to the citizens. That's one of its roles as a human rights country that has aspired to being, an organization that protects and fulfills the rights of all its citizens. It's guaranteed in the Constitution. So for me, to a large degree, the state is failing women in the case of protection, but it's also failing women in terms of access to justice. So there's a lot of work that needs to happen, and the problem is that the disconnect of rural communities, from the kinds of initiatives that are taking place to support women is quite serious. So we have a lot of focus now on gender-based violence in the country because of the National Strategic Plan. There are many initiatives being rolled out. It's just not happening at a pace fast enough to be able to really protect women and girl children. And I think it's important to again say that the low status of women in society hasn't changed. And that's one of the key drivers of gender-based violence. And we have to work much more strategically, strongly on prevention.
I'm really concerned, Doctor, when you talk about the low status of women that continues to persist in our society. You know, we commemorate the 16 days of activism every year, but, you know, it seems that things in fact keep getting worse for women every year, and now when you're pointing out the fact that, you know, this low status of women in society just persists, what is there then to commemorate when we're talking about the 16 days of activism, when, you know, nothing much changes for women?
Yeah, look, I think the 16 days of activism is a period for us to take stock. It's a moment when we stop and reflect on what have been the achievements, and there have been some. We've had a change in legislation, we've had, you know, an uptake on various government programs, some more TCCs, you know, that are provided and so forth. We have the Gender-Based Violence Fund that provides funding to women's organizations. So there are some achievements which are rather small, but there are achievements. So 16 days of activism, we look at that. But we also then say, what are we not doing correctly? Why are our responses still inadequate? Our responses are inadequate because we're not dealing with a big political issue, which is women's status in society. And that's going to take a very, very big effort from everybody to change that. And I think there's no real political will to change it. When I say political will, I don't just mean politicians, I mean society as a whole, because there is an economic benefit to society to have women in, you know, continue with this low status, because we provide reproductive work, you know, in the homes and the family that's unremunerated. So the problem is pretty deep and it's wide, and we don't really dig deep enough to address that issue. A lot of what we do in prevention work is still too superficial. We need to change norms, attitudes and behaviors, and that takes a very, very big effort by everybody in society.
Yeah, you were talking about where we are getting it right, and I want to continue on this, and I wonder, you know, what your perception of, you know, courts and how they handle issues related to GBV. It does seem as though the courts somewhat do get it right. It seems as though, you know, harsher sentences are being imposed when we're seeing cases related to GBV. Is that a trend that we're seeing? And, you know, it might not be stopping, you know, these criminals and their behavior, but certainly it does seem to be some sort of a positive in a way forward when it comes to dealing with GBV issues.
Yes, I think we must, you know, we like to acknowledge the fact that there are definitely pockets of excellence that are emerging in different state agents, you know, the criminal justice system, sometimes in health, sometimes in, you know, social development and so forth. But I think we have a long way to go. We all acknowledge that because we can see that the numbers continue to rise and that a lot of work has to happen. And I think the slowness of the work is also attributed to the fact that changing the mindsets, you know, of men and women and girls and boys in our society is a very big job. So that's not happening, you know, as much as what we like. But we do applaud the changes. We do applaud the fact that when women cases get to court, that there are good judgments coming out of it, and there is a concerted effort to address this issue. And we're very much aware of the fact that, you know, across many courts, people are working really hard to bring that about. But we're also aware of the fact that it's not consistent. It's not spread across the entire criminal justice system. And I think that requires a lot of hard work. So in rural areas, you still have, you know, very archaic perceptions of how to address these issues. There's still a lot of shame and blame that gets put on the shoulders of women for the violence that happens in our society. So we need a lot more work around that. But there are also, you know, times when we see real excellence. What concerns many of us in the sector, though, is very poor follow-up, very poor investigative measures taken when you have femicide cases, because you don't hear about the arrests of, men that have killed women on a very large scale. You don't hear that, and often the deaths of the women go unpunished. So it's not just what the courts, the justice the courts meter out, but whether those cases actually come to court is a whole different issue. So you lose a lot of cases from the time they reported to the time they should actually be, appear in court with the perpetrators being held accountable. That's a very slow process, and I think we know that we lose a lot of women that are not able to access justice because that investigative process is flawed. All along the criminal justice value chain, there are weaknesses, and we need to be cognizant of that fact. A lot better work can be done around that.
Dr. Foster, always great to see you. Thank you very much for giving us your time and the work that you do. Dr. Lesley Ann Foster with Masimanyane Women's Rights International.